What a great, great morning it is. All right. Well, I want to share a few thoughts this morning about peace. And as we get started, I want to actually invite our team up there to show you a picture. And so this picture, as we talk about a different kind of peace, this picture is really amazing. And so this picture is what's known as an anechoic chamber. All right, say it with me. Anechoic chamber. I knew you could. And so this anechoic chamber is the quietest, most peaceful place on earth. Hands down, it's the most peaceful place. There are other anechoic chambers, but this one that you're looking at is the quietest, the most peaceful. They actually measured it, and it somehow measures at a negative 9.6 decibels. That means this chamber is quieter than absolutely quiet. And I don't even know how that works physically, but they promise that it does. And so this is so absolutely peaceful, so absolutely quiet. It's a black hole of sound. And so when you go inside of there, it actually begins to play tricks on your senses. And so if you're in there for more than just a few minutes, they have to put you in with a chair because you become disoriented and you can't even stand. You lose your ability to balance inside of the anechoic chamber. And it becomes a very unsettling proposal for you as you sit there. And so it turns out that absolute peace is not as peaceful as we thought it would be. In fact, people have tried to see how long they can stay inside of the anechoic chamber, and it turns out that so far the record at the time that I read this article was 45 minutes. That's the longest anybody could handle absolute peace is 45 minutes. Anything more than that, they're afraid that they might lose their minds. And so as we talk about how unsettling even this kind of peace is, it raises the question of what is peace? What does it really mean? And so I went looking, and you start at the most obvious place. I Googled it, and I Googled a dictionary definition of peace, and here's what I found is that peace is freedom from disturbance. So according to the dictionary and to Google, peace is freedom from disturbance. So according to our natural understanding, peace is achieved in the absence of disturbances. So, we're used to a kind of peace and a paradigm of peace where it comes from having no disturbances. So you can have peace if you have no financial disturbances. You can have peace if you have no physical disturbances, no sickness, no symptoms. You can have peace if there's no looming questions that you just can't answer. And so hopefully you're beginning to track with me that no disturbances equals peace. And the reverse of that, I think you can figure out, is true for us usually as well. So if you have disturbances, then that sometimes means no peace. So in our typical understanding, peace is the result of eliminating disturbances, right? And so that raises a problem, though, because there's a lot of things that are going on in life that you just can't control. There are things that happen that are beyond your ability to control. Like, you can take all the precautions, and we encourage you, follow all CDC, guidelines and recommendations. But even if you do, the truth is you can't control whether or not you get sick. You can't control job loss and the decisions that your company makes. You can't control the bottom line of your finances. You can be wise and you can do things, but you can't control the bottom line sometimes. You can't control whether those that you love get sick either. You see, there's just so many disturbances that you have no ability to eliminate. And so that raises a real problem for our prospects of peace if we can't eliminate disturbances. So if we have disturbances that we cannot eliminate, does that just mean that we have to give up on the idea of peace? Right? And so some of us we've just given up. We say, hey, I'm just not going to have peace during this season of life. Or maybe some of us, we turn to artificial forms of peace. And so one of those is to live in denial, not a river in Egypt, but denial. And so we live in denial. We put on rose-colored glasses and we just pretend things are better than they are, and we try to avoid thinking about uncomfortable and difficult realities. We try to hide from them. We try to replace those thoughts with others, and that works for a time, but the truth is, you know this already, it's difficult to keep reality from breaking through. And there's all these moments where you're trying to push reality back and not think about it and not accept it. And so living in denial is not really a long-term solution. And so some of us choose to kind of create our own artificial forms of peace, like chemical peace. And so maybe during this time you've already begun to notice yourself slipping into patterns where you're drinking too much, or maybe you're getting high, you're turning to improper use of medicines and things like that to try to just create this chemical peace. Or maybe you're turning to looking at things online and trying to find some peace or some gratification through some other unhealthy releases. Maybe you're beginning to eat in really unhealthy ways, and you're compulsively eating, and you're trying to comfort and bring peace through food, or through tuning out to the world and just watching as much Netflix as you can, and just trying to just numb your brain with wavelengths. And so there's all kinds of ways that we try to drown it out. We try to create artificial peace to cover the disturbance. But it's kind of like this thing I've mentioned before in the past, and it's something that I've heard of people doing. And so sometimes if you have a car and your engine or some moving part of your car begins making a troubling noise. How many of you guys have had that happen? Even in these last few days, maybe you've had some car problems, right? So you're driving your car and you start hearing this very concerning noise. And so maybe you don't know much about cars, and so you don't try to diagnose the problem, and you don't have the money for repairs right now. And so the solution for some of us is to just turn the radio up louder. And so you just turn up the stereo loud enough that you can't hear that troubling noise. And that works for a while, but eventually the problem intensifies and the noise gets louder. So what do? You turn the dial more. You crank it up louder, and you just get in this system where every time problems intensify, you just turn up the noise that you're using, the artificial peace, to drown it out. And we do that. And so we just drink more and more and more and more, and we eat more and more and more. We do all these things more and more. We're just trying to turn up the volume to drown out the disturbance. But what happens in those situations is the same as what happens to the car. As you turn up that stereo, eventually the engine blows and the whole thing just comes grinding to a halt. And that's the downfall of artificial peace, is that it's never a long-term solution. And all of these short-term things that we think are wins, that we think are helping us, they end up with great long-term costs. So what do we do? What do we do? Do we just give up on peace? Do we use artificial peace? I'm here to tell you today that there is a different answer. In John chapter 14, verse 27, Jesus told us this. He said, "Peace I leave with you. My peace. I don't give it to you as the world gives. So do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." I love how he says that. I'm leaving you with this peace, as if I've set it right here on the couch next to you. I'm not going to impose it on you. I'm not going to force it on you, but there is a peace available if you'll learn to pick it up and put it on. And that's what we're going to do here this morning. And so first I want to tell you that Jesus was telling his disciples and us indirectly that there's this other kind of peace available. He was saying, listen, I'm going to give you a type of peace that functions totally differently than anything you're used to. Right? So I know that you think you understand peace, Jesus says, but I'm giving you a kind of peace that works completely differently than what you're used to seeing and experiencing. And so because of that, even in the midst of disturbances, you don't have to be troubled. You don't have to be afraid. And so Jesus is offering us this morning a peace that functions totally differently than standard peace. It works totally. And so I want you to imagine, because in the middle of this thing, as he's saying this, you have to understand what he's just told his disciples. So Jesus is having a very intense conversation with his disciples. And so in the sentences and chapters just before the verse I just read, where he said, I'm giving you peace, he was telling them some really disturbing news. So Jesus had told them that one of their own, Judas, one of their 12, they're with them at the dinner table. He said, listen, one of our own is going to betray me into the hands of other men. And he goes as far as to predict his own death. And he goes even further, and he's saying, listen, all of you guys are going to lose confidence in me. You're going to lose faith. You're going to run for your lives. And Peter, the biggest, the strongest, the best of all of us, the one called the Rock, Peter, you're going to deny even knowing me. So that's the news that Jesus is giving them. He gives them all of this news. And then after giving them that news, he says, my peace I give you, and my peace doesn't function like the kind of peace you're used to. So you don't have to be troubled. You don't have to be afraid. So, I mean, just get your head around for a minute where these people would have been, where these disciples, where their minds would have been when he said, don't be afraid. Don't be troubled. I'm giving you peace. They're thinking, Jesus, you just told us that everything is going to go wrong. You just told us that everything we've worked for these last 3.5 years is going to be ripped apart, taken from us, and the best of us are going to crumble and fall. How are we supposed to have peace in the middle of that? And so here's the point I want to make, and then we're going to tell a story, is that Jesus' peace is specially designed to function in disturbance. It's specially designed to function in disturbance. It was made for this stuff. You see, in our lives right now, they're full of disturbance. Our world is full of disturbance. Our city, our state, all around us, there's disturbance. But Jesus' peace, what he's offering to us, it was built for situations just like this. Right? This is where it comes into its own. This is what it was designed for. The natural world offers a peace that is freedom from disturbances. So you can be peaceful if there's nothing bad going on with natural peace. But Jesus offers a peace that is freedom in disturbances. And so you can have natural peace, which is freedom from disturbance, or you can have Jesus' peace, which is freedom in disturbances. And so we're going to just share a quick story that kind of lines this out, and it'll make this point better than just linear points can make it. And so going back about 4,000 years now, there's this man in the Bible. His name is Joseph. If you want to read this later, the story takes place in the book of Genesis between chapters 37 and chapter 50. And so, again, 4,000 years ago, there was this young man, an older teenager or a young adult man, and his name was Joseph. And Joseph was young, and he had all these older brothers, lots and lots of brothers. And Joseph was just like that kid that everyone, hates to be around, just because he was so good looking, he was so talented, he was so intelligent, and he was just good at everything he did. Everything he touched seemed to succeed. And because of that, his brothers hated him. He was his dad's favorite, right? And everyone knew it, and his brothers really grew to detest him. And one day things just went too far with his brothers. His brothers were way out in the field by themselves, and they kind of cooked up a plan as Joseph was approaching. And at first they decided, that's it, we're just going to kill him. One of the brothers kind of speaks some sense into the situation and says, let's not kill him, right? And so they throw him in a pit while they figure out what they're going to do. And then a band of slave traders, of human traffickers, are coming by out in the desert. So they decide to sell their brother as a slave to these slave traders. They then take his jacket, they cover it in blood to take home and show Dad and say, look, Dad, Joseph was killed by an animal. We're so sorry. that you lost your son. And so now Joseph is in the custody of these slave traders, these traffickers, and they're taking him to Egypt. And so within the matter of days, Joseph finds himself on the auction block in an Egyptian slave market. He's bought by a man named Potiphar, who it just turns out he happens to be like a high-ranking Egyptian official. He's a wealthy man, a well-connected man, and a powerful man with a huge household, large business interests. And Joseph was bought to be a slave in Potiphar's household. So he goes. And unlike me, I would have been sulking. I would have been angry. I would have been mad. I would have been screaming for my rights because of the injustice, but not Joseph. Joseph looked at his surroundings. He accepted them, and he went right to work just trying to make the most of it. Joseph worked hard in Potiphar's house. He gave it his absolute best effort. He worked well with others. Everything he did for some reason just seemed to succeed. It just seemed to flourish. And so as he's doing things, it's evident that God's blessing is on Joseph's life. And so even as he's serving as a slave, what happens is everyone who's over him in the household keeps noticing how good he is and how everything he does succeeds. So they keep promoting him up, and they keep promoting him up, and they keep promoting him up. And it's because God's blessing is on Joseph, which I want you to stop and take a second with me and wrap your mind around that. Joseph is in a foreign country, having been betrayed by his family, and he is a slave. He's owned by someone else. His circumstances are so wrong. And yet in the midst of that circumstance, somehow God's blessing is still on him. It didn't change his circumstances. It didn't get him out of slavery, but God's blessing is on him in the middle of these messed up circumstances. And so that blessing continues to cause him to flourish and prosper to the point to where it's so recognized that Potiphar himself makes Joseph the head of the entire household. He is in charge of every business deal, every servant, everything that happens goes through Joseph. He's second only to Potiphar himself. He has free reign of everything in the household. He's super blessed, and Potiphar is blessed as a result of having Joseph with him. And through the course of time, again, Joseph was a good-looking young man. Potiphar's wife gets eyes for Joseph. And she starts coming on to him in increasingly, progressively more forward ways. Joseph's polite, says no, and it finally comes to a head. And he again has to make a very clear denial of her attempts. And it's crazy because even though Joseph had been so dishonored, as Potiphar's wife is coming on to him, he actually says, listen, I cannot disobey my God and I cannot dishonor my master. He's trusted me with so much, and I will not violate his trust by doing this with you. And so after Joseph denies this final attempt with Potiphar's wife, she's scorned and insulted. And so she makes a false claim that Joseph had tried to rape her. Well, as you can imagine, the fallout for that was huge. And Joseph finds himself in prison. And here's the crazy thing. It was bad enough he was sold as a slave. He re-engaged in that setting and he climbed to the top. But here he is, he finds himself in prison, and rather than feeling sorry for himself, rather than refusing to accept the conditions, he does the same thing. He accepts that this is his circumstances, and he goes right to work, working for his jailers. Anything he can do to serve, anything he can do to help, he's kind to people, and he's immediately recognized as a very helpful person. And again, for some reason, God's blessing is still on his life. Even though he's in a prison, that blessing hasn't gotten him out of prison, but God is blessing everything Joseph's hands touch. And so he begins to gain influence in the prison. And they put him over more, even though he's himself a prisoner, they put him over more and more tasks until eventually he is the second in command only to the prison master himself. He's in charge of every staff person. He's in charge of everything that happens inside the prison. He enables the prison master to really just kick back because Joseph's got it all under control. And everything he does flourishes because God has blessed him in this setting. And then one day, something interesting happens. Two high-ranking political officials are put in prison. These men served the king of Egypt directly. They were directly in his presence. There was some scuffle and some mistrust, and so they were both thrown in prison until the king could decipher which one of the two of them was guilty and which one betrayed him. And so that night, these two high-ranking political prisoners both had these really strange dreams. And they tell their dreams to Joseph. And God gives Joseph the supernatural ability to interpret these dreams and predict the future of these men. And Joseph tells the men, listen, you're going to die, sorry. You're going to be restored to your position with the king. And some time goes by, and the dreams are fulfilled just as Joseph predicted. And so this one man finds himself back in the palace with the king, serving again, restored to his position. And some time goes by, and the king of Egypt has a very troubling dream. And he tells it to all of his wise men and all of his counselors, and nobody can give him a meaning for it. No one can tell him what they think it means. And then this official remembers, oh, there was this guy in prison. And I told him my dream, and the other guy, he told him his dream, and he told us, and everything he said came true. And so obviously the king calls for Joseph to be brought to him from the prison. He tells Joseph the dream. Joseph interprets the king's dream. And as he does so, he tells him the meaning, which is to boil it down, is simply this, that right now, Egypt is experiencing 7 years of abundance, and there's more than enough of everything. But on the end of that, we're going to have 7 years of crippling famine. And so the king hears that interpretation of the dream, and he just immediately senses that it's true and that it's right. And Joseph doesn't stop with the interpretation. Joseph goes on and says, listen, I have a plan. If you'll allow me to, I will save Egypt during this time. During these 7 years, if we collect this much grain from everyone and we stockpile it, then when the 7 years of famine come, we'll be able to weather the storm just fine. The king hears, he recognizes again this blessing on Joseph, and he immediately says, absolutely, and he puts Joseph in charge of the national effort to prepare for the famine that they think is coming. Joseph does that. Some years go by. He's continuing to prepare. And during that time, again, God blesses everything Joseph touches. He's so good at everything that he goes from just being in charge of the response effort to then they just give him more and more and more responsibilities in the government because he's that gifted, he's that talented. And they don't recognize it as God's blessing, but that's what it was. And so time goes by, and it gets to the point in the story where now Joseph is now second in charge of all of Egypt, second only to the king himself. Well, the time of famine comes, and Joseph's plan is working to a T. There's still plenty of food in Egypt. In fact, there's so much food in Egypt that they can now open up and they're selling grain to outsiders, to other nations that are coming, and they're buying grain so that they can survive because this famine is pretty widespread. Well, the famine reaches where Joseph's family was originally from. And they don't know Joseph is where he is today, but they journey to Egypt to buy grain from Egypt to survive the famine. So here comes all of Joseph's brothers, the ones that sold him into slavery decades ago at this point, and they show up, and Joseph immediately recognizes them, but they don't immediately recognize him. And there's this long series of events that I won't go into, but eventually it gets to the point to where they recognize Joseph and they know it's him, and they're scared to death. And they're begging for mercy, and they're saying, Joseph, please forgive us for what we did to you. They're afraid that he could just have them killed, or he could deny them grain, which would essentially kill them as well. And so here's this moment, this opportunity, this defining moment in the story. And here's what Joseph says to his terrified brothers. He says, don't be afraid. You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it. That's actually Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. And I'll say it again. He said, don't be afraid. You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it. You see, God did not necessarily stop those bad things from happening to Joseph. But in the middle of all of those situations, God was still able to bless Joseph and to cause him to flourish in whatever circumstance. So when he was sold as a slave to Potiphar, right? Even as a slave in Potiphar's house, he had more purpose than he would have had at home where his brothers were. He was more successful. He was more powerful. He was more blessed, even as a slave, than his brothers would have been. And then when he went to prison, even in a prison, he rose to such a position that he had more purpose, more authority, more power, even in a prison than his brothers back home. But then especially as he was moved then to serve the king. His life had more purpose. It had more impact. It was more important than his brothers back home. And so what his brothers intended to harm him with, God used to bless him and bless the world. See, they never would have dreamed that this would have moved his life in such a positive direction, but God was able to do that. You see, in the middle of bad situations and unfair treatment, Joseph was still able to have peace all along. He was able to accept his situations and trust God for the outcomes. And there's this New Testament scripture that really speaks to this. It says that when we're faithful in small things, that God then puts us over larger and larger things. And so as we look at Joseph's response, I just want to challenge you with your life, whatever that small thing is you've been entrusted with, right? In these days, as your world has shrunk so much, what does it look like to be faithful with the small opportunities that you currently have? To not be upset about what is happening or isn't happening, what you can do or what you can't do, to not sit there and be sad about it, but to look at your circumstance and say, however small this opportunity is, what does it look like for me to be faithful with this? And as I'm faithful with this, God's promise is that he'll give me then more to be faithful over, and then more to be faithful over. And that's exactly what happened to Joseph. In the middle of it, he didn't wrestle over what he could or couldn't do. He was just faithful with the opportunity in front of him, and that brought peace. And then in the end, what was meant for evil ended up being a huge blessing in his life, and it saved the lives of millions of people and then pointed people to God. The outcomes of this were just phenomenal, and it was all because of what God was able to do with it. And so I want to ask you as we bring this back around, do you remember the promise of Jesus in John 14? Do you remember it? Peace I leave with you. I don't give peace like the world does. I give you a different kind of peace. Right? And I want to remind you, he's not going to impose this peace on you. He's not going to just force it on you like a sweater, right? This is a peace that he leaves for you, and you have to choose to pick up. And so it starts with understanding it. And so the big point I want to make is that God's peace is freedom in disturbance. This world's sense of peace is only freedom from disturbance. And so we first have to accept that a lot of times there's going to be disturbances. But God is big enough to use those disturbances to ultimately bless you, flourish you, and prosper you if you'll be patient and if you'll be faithful in the circumstance. That's how God works. His peace is made for disturbance. And so there's a great New Testament verse that actually explains the theological side of what was going on in the story of Joseph, and I think it'll even pop up on your screen there. It's Romans 8:28, and it says this, "And we know that in all things God works to the good of those who love him and those who are called according to his purpose." Now this verse gets thrown around a lot in faith circles, and sadly we misquote it a lot, and we misapply what it's actually saying. And so I hear people, when bad things happen a lot, I hear people say, well, it's okay, brother, just have faith because everything happens for a reason. And that's not what Romans 8:28 is saying. It's not saying that everything happens for a reason and that God has a purpose for all of this. It's saying that when evil things happen, God works them to the good. You see, there's more than one will at work in the world. There is the will of God, and God does institute a lot of things, but there's also the will of evil. And so there's evil itself, there's people, there's free choice, there's all of these things. There's the curse of sin that's at work in the world, which broke the world and broke people. So there's all kinds of circumstances that come from a sin-sick and broken world that aren't necessarily God's choosing. He wouldn't have sent them. But the promise is that no matter what comes, whether it's his sending or whether it's the will of evil, that no matter what circumstances come your way, in all things, he can take them and work them to the good. So God is good. Our situations are not always good as they begin, but the promise is that if you'll be faithful, if you'll trust him, that he'll take those and he'll turn them into good given enough time. You see, what Romans 8:28, what that's promising us is that once bad things do happen, God is so good and he's so powerful and he's so full of wisdom that he's able to take this thing that was meant for bad and he's able to smash it and twist it and manipulate it and move it around and reshape it so that eventually it's something good. It's shaped into something that blesses you. It's shaped into something that blesses those around you, that ultimately advances good in the world. That's what that promise is. It didn't start off good, but he is wise and he's got foresight and he can move and manipulate and reshape all of that and turn it for your good. And that's just what Joseph experienced. That's exactly what his story shows us in living color. Right? That's what Joseph experienced. That's what Joseph said. He recognized it in his own story. He said, listen, you meant that stuff for evil. That stuff was meant for my harm. But God produced good from it. So guys, I want to encourage you this morning, whatever happens through this season, whatever happens to you, whatever happens in the world around us, whatever happens through this season, God will twist it, he'll turn it, he'll manipulate it, he'll shape it, and in the end, he'll use it for your good. Whatever happens to you physically, in the end, it will be good. It may not feel good as it's happening. Often it doesn't. But on the other side of it, God's power and God's wisdom and his goodness will shine through and use it for the good. Whatever happens in your employment situation, with your job, with your own company, whatever that is, whatever happens with that through this season, God will use it to your good. Whatever happens to you financially through this season, God will use that to your good. Right? That is what we see played out in Joseph's story. Evil, terrible things done to him, right? Just bad things happening to him around. And you just think, when you think it can't get any worse, oh, we're throwing him in a pit. That's terrible, right? And then he's sold as a slave. You think, oh, that can't get any worse. And then he's a slave, but then he gets accused of a horrible crime and it just got worse. And then he finds himself in prison and it seems to just keep getting worse. So it went from bad to worse. But even in all of that, God was able to take it and shape it and twist it and make something amazing from it. And that's why we can have peace. That's why we can have hope. We don't have to pretend like the stuff that's happening to us isn't hard. We don't have to pretend like it isn't bad. We just have to figure out what it looks like to be faithful in this and to trust him and wait. And he'll shape this and he'll make it for our good. He'll fill us with hope for it. And so the hope and the peace of Jesus, this promise is bigger than any circumstance. It's bigger than any problem. It's bigger than anything that can go wrong because there is no expiration date. Right? Even after it happens, he can work it on the backside and make it into something that blesses you and prospers you. Now, I want to encourage you to understand this process. It takes different amounts of time for different things. And as I'm describing it, I'm sure you've thought of situations already where that's happened in your life. And in some struggles, you may quickly see God working on your behalf to bless you. You know, you might lose your job and the next day you get a call from this other place and, hey, we heard you're available and it's even better. And so in some struggles, you may quickly see God immediately turning to bless you. But then there's also going to be other things where the blessing and the good that are going to come from this, they will not be apparent right away. It'll take more time. All right, I'm sure it took time. It probably took a good deal of time for Joseph to climb to the point at which he was in Potiphar's house. It probably took some time for the good to be apparent there. It definitely took some time for the good to be apparent in the prison, right? And so sometimes you'll see, immediately, even if you don't see the evidence of it happening, you'll see how it could be good soon. And sometimes you'll look at it and you just won't see yet why it's going to be good. You just have to trust him that he's big enough to take that and shape it for your good. You see, the promise in Romans 8 is whether it takes a long time or whether it takes a short time, whether it's a really bad circumstance or whether it's just marginally bad, the promise is that in all things he works to the good. In all things he works to the good for you. Whether that all things, maybe that moment for you feels like Potiphar's house, right? It's not ideal, but it's not terrible. Or whether it feels like the prison, which is probably about as low as it can feel, or whether it feels like a palace, right? Some of us, maybe we haven't felt all the effects of this yet, right? But whether it's a pit, Potiphar's house, a prison, or a palace, in all things, he works to the good of those who love him, who are called. And that's what we see in Joseph's story, and that's what we're going to see in the days ahead as you walk through these circumstances. Right? You'll begin to see glimmers. You'll begin to see just traces of what God is doing behind the scenes. I want to invite our band to come and get close because we're going to go back and sing here in just a second. I'm going to leave you again with Jesus' words, the way we started. In John 14:27, he said this, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give it as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." You see, guys, real peace is not peace from disturbance. If that's your idea, you will never have peace. There's always going to be disturbance. Real peace is peace in disturbance. He is big enough for that. He was big enough to reshape all of those crazy details to turn Joseph's situation not just into a blessing for him, but into a blessing that saved millions of lives from starvation and pointed millions of people to God and is still pointing people to God right now. What God did in Joseph's life all those years ago, it still has traction today. It's still pointing you to hope and to peace and to encouragement today. And so if he was able to do it with those circumstances, then I guarantee he's able to do it with any disturbances that are in your world today. I'm going to pray and these guys are going to sing. Father, we're so grateful. We're so grateful because you're so much bigger than any of the struggles. You're so much bigger than any of the worries. You're so much bigger than sickness. You're bigger than financial struggle. You're bigger than job worries. You're bigger than the struggle that we have with isolation and all of that. You're bigger than all of that. And so you're able to take what was meant for evil. You're able to take what was meant to harm us and to use it for our good, and ultimately not just for our good, but to bless the world and to be a light in the world around us. And so we give you great thanks for that, and we trust you. And we ask that you to help us in the middle of this to pick up this peace that you leave for us and to choose to put it on, to choose to trust, to choose to be faithful in whatever small circumstance we're given, and then to watch you as you bless that and you expand that and you help us to flourish even in disturbance. We give you thanks for that. In Jesus' name, amen. God, in the middle of disturbances, in the middle of storms, in the middle of circumstances, I pray this morning that you would help us to turn our focus on you and to understand that the final word and the outcome of all of this is really in your hands and not in ours and not even in society as a whole, but your God, you're sovereign over all. And so we entrust ourselves to you. We entrust ourselves to your care and to your working of your will and blessing through this situation. I pray that you'd give us faith. I pray that you'd fill us with courage. I pray that you'd give us the ability to be faithful in whatever small ways we can now and to watch as you bless us and give us more to be faithful in. We give you great thanks for that, God. Bless this church. Bless everyone that's watching online and that experiences this today. I pray that you'd give us the confidence to have your peace in disturbance. And we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, God bless you. We'll see you again next week. Don't forget to invite some folks to watch with you. We'll talk to you guys next time. God bless you. Have a great Sunday.